Believe it or not, you are listening to a new episode of the Casting Shadows podcast. And I don't know which one of us should be more surprised, you, dear listener, or me, that is taking place, but it's taking place. And for fear of interruption or dog explosion or something else, while I've got this free time, my intention is to be brief, to be quick about it. Let's see if I can actually maintain that. My intention for this episode is to talk about Chaosium's BRP, the basic role-playing, for a little bit. I got inspired to discuss it, and it's with you, dear listener, that I would like to discuss it. And I am having a little bit of what has been discussed on the Audio Dungeon Discord server as this challenge of getting podcast episodes out, mostly because of work, partly because of noise whenever I want to record, that sort of thing, and a sense that I would like to provide a better audio quality to podcast listeners, and that aforementioned noise, mainly from the dogs, wars against that. But I have it on good authority from Joe Richter of the Hindsightless podcast that despite the lack of a routine nature in my releases of podcast episodes, that this podcast, as sporadic as it is nowhere near as sporadic as his podcast, which he has identified as the most sporadic podcast on the internet. So I can take some comfort in that. But without further ado, we're going to move to the first topic on this episode's agenda, which is to discuss some topics which have come and gone in other people's podcasts that I wanted to call in and comment on, and just sadly couldn't find the time, and now it's much too late. Okay, the first thing I'd like to talk about in this section on missed conversations and missed opportunities for discussion pertains to The Arcane Alienist, as hosted by BJ Boyd. He's done a series of episodes and call-in episodes where he's working with and working beyond and working in different ways from a conversation that I had with Jay Webster on Roleplay Rescue about how we conceive about, what play is and what play can be. And we can look at this in the aspect of how intentionally are we working toward story, and how intentionally are we trying to get into the shoes of the character, and how do we speak to each other, the role of memory and imagination and description on our play, and the effect of shifting back and forth of our attention from the various things that go on in play versus trying not to do that, and that sort of thing. And there's just so much to talk about that for a simple recorded comment, it would be an epic number of short recorded comments and the like. So I think what I should do is invite BJ to come and be a guest on this very sporadic but not ultimately sporadic podcast, and talk with me about some of those things and how his thoughts on these subjects are, formed and framed by his play, and see what we can come up with in the interaction of ideas. I think that would be a lot of fun. So if I can orchestrate the time and match it up with his free time, I think that would be nice. So I'll give that a try. But speaking of challenges in finding the time, there are several projects that I'd like to undertake with Jason Connerly of the Nerds RPG Variety Cast, which, for reasons that are mainly my fault, keep being bumped. Fortunately, we were able to get together with Jason and David Chapman, the co-host of RPG A Day, and he was kind enough to interview us on that topic, and I hope you've already listened to that episode. And hopefully that episode has burned its way into your heart and mind and soul and has inspired you to participate in whatever way satisfies you for RPG Day 2025. But recently, Jason has been doing a variety of episodes on different movies, and I've been enjoying listening to him and Daniel from Bandit's Keep talking about Chuck Norris movies and how they might like to bring those to the table. Those conversations are a lot of fun, and I really hope that people do call in and leave messages for both of them about different Chuck Norris movies or other action movies of the era to tease out the things that are important to you when you're translating film or other media to your own settings. And how important is genre, how important is characterization, how important are things like the perception of character ability as seen on screen as relates to the system you intend to use for it. Can you be satisfied using something like a mooks or minions rule? Or does it feel like if you're playing a normal human Chuck Norris fighter guy that every person they come up against should also be a normal human Chuck Norris fighter guy? And, let the dice sort things out. Lots of different questions about all of that. I personally have found a lot of satisfaction using the Ubiquity role-playing system, the way that its minions rule, its blade fodder or cannon fodder rules, plus its size rules, which allows things like small creatures and whatnot to also present a different kind of threat. The way its assistance rules tie in to let a minion who would not normally be much of a threat to a standard character in Ubiquity become more of a threat by cooperating with other such minions. Similarly, in Star Wars role-playing, originally from Fantasy Flight Games, but now with Edge Studios, there was a very interesting way of handling minions which allowed them to appropriately be threatening to characters in the right kind of situation and not be very threatening to characters outside of those situations. But yeah, I hope lots of people have lots of things to say about turning film, books, and whatnot into gameable concepts at the table, and direct those calls to Jason and Daniel at the Nerds RPG Variety Cast. I think the last topic that I'll risk taking the time talking about now for is the idea of the ongoing AD&D First Edition campaign that's being related to us in bloody battle notes by the Pink Phantom on the Phantom Thoughts podcast. Well, I'm not a D&D player anymore by any stretch of the imagination. I'm still fascinated to listen to what's happening to these different groups of characters and the world in which they live in. Because recently we've been getting conflict and combats that are growing from the events of play and are contributing to the world building and the world expansion by virtue of how the system is being used to set up who these combatants are, what they want, where they are, all that stuff. It's been pretty enjoyable, and in a sense, kind of like climbing back into a time machine to all the discussions about play that we had when gaming was new to us. Anyway, if you haven't been listening to those recaps of that ongoing campaign, I recommend them. They're fun to listen to, and they make the miles go by so much faster. This next segment for this episode of the podcast is about Chaosium's basic role-playing. And I don't think that section will need much introduction. Let's let's just talk about BRP. I own a lot of different games which use Chaosium's basic role-playing, or BRP, as it came to be known. My first, as we've mentioned here on the podcast before, was Call of Cthulhu. That was the 4th edition of Call of Cthulhu, which really means, for the most part, it was the 3rd edition of Call of Cthulhu. But we don't need to get into those details. More BRP games would follow steadily over the years and then decades that followed. This part of the episode is about that, and partly about the system as it's presented on the page. So, from my perspective, BRP began with very auspicious beginnings. First appearing in RuneQuest in 1978, BRP started right away making waves. As an RPG system, as we all know, it was not the first out of the gate, or even the second. And though early as this appearance might seem now, looking backward, Chaosium can also be seen as having taken time to reflect on what was needed in a text for what could finally, by the time they released it, be seen as a new and separate activity in its own right, separate from the similar games and the related activities which had come before. In design, the creators could benefit from seeing the effects of the approaches taken by those who had preceded them. They could see how it affected their play and learn how it had affected the play of others, or the ability to learn how to play by others. They had time to read the games that came before and consider and maybe reconsider how it might be framed and explained differently. More than this, they of course had their own life experiences to draw upon, and what those experiences taught them about civilization, about society, culture, the quest for the magical or the mystical, or that something ineffable beyond us, the urge toward and the consequences of violence. RuneQuest reflected all of this, and it spoke to those who found it and subsequently spread it. For important context, I think it's necessary to look back on the first edition of RuneQuest, which is where the system first is presented. And one thing that makes me smile is how the team of writers and designers at Chaosium in 1978 managed, on the very first page of text in their very first RPG, right there on page 5, to discover what would then somehow become like the missing holy grail from so many other role-playing games and companies that would follow. People today still have arguments about what should and should not be in those all-important opening pages, and how the concept of what the book you're holding even is should be communicated to the reader, but they nailed it right out of the gate. They talk about 4 things on that first page. What is an RPG as they knew it? What is this RPG about, which they knew very well, because they had intentionally designed toward it. How to use these rules, and by that they meant how to learn them, get good at them, and then play them with confidence. And will there or won't there be any additional rules? It's pretty impressive. Particularly, what is this RPG about, and how do you learn to play it? It leaves me feeling that there was an uncommon amount of uncommonly good sense in that team, demonstrated on that page and in many of the pages which followed. Right away from the point of its release, BRP would demonstrate that it was malleable, flexible, and powerful. And over those years, BRP was, as the writers had promised on that fifth page in 1978, it was used for a variety of other games, ranging from licensed fantasy and science fiction properties in Stormbringer and Ringworld, through the adaptation of the, at that time, largely unremembered Lovecraft Circle, becoming what is largely felt to be the first horror RPG, and even the adaptation of the literary traditions of King Arthur into the groundbreaking icon of an RPG that is Pendragon. And still, among all of this incredible and inspiring creativity, there was still room left to set up Superworld and give us superheroes, which exploded first for Chaosium from Worlds of Wonder, and then more decisively in their own title, Superworld. And while that was going on within the confines of Chaosium, the company, gamers far and wide were rapidly turning BRP to whatever need or desire they could imagine. You know, we make a lot these days of companies which produce a bespoke version of their house system for each new genre and subgenre of game that they release. Maybe we've started to take it for granted. Notable among these new companies is Modiphius, with all the variations of 2D20, tuned for specific purposes, and Free League, with the same thing for its Year Zero. That idea, however, was firmly in evidence in the early days of the hobby, and systems like BRP and Hero and later GURPS would provide very different paths to doing it well, and are still doing it to this day. So what then was so special about BRP and continues to be special about it? Well, preference is a funny thing, and I've met people over the years who don't care for BRP at all. And that makes me wonder, but for many people, BRP hits a precise point where it makes a clear and resonant kind of sense. It's grounded in the experience of being human and the underpinning logic or logics of whatever imagined worlds we might create. It surges with brutal magic and the even more brutal harm people can inflict upon each other and receive in turn. It finds ways to make risk easy to run, yet pleasantly agonizing to choose. It has a lot to say about who the characters we play are, yet still has the room to listen to our ideas as well. It is incredibly responsive to the ongoing events of play, and characters change in surprising and satisfying ways as they make their way through imagined situations to realize the goals that we share with them. It has a boldness about how it sets characters in a very human mold, yet expects better of them, expects more of them, like it's saying anyone can be a hero. They just have to act well. So, by the time that 2008 rolled around, the value of a collected set of the rules, concepts, and approaches which had appeared in all of these varied publications was obvious. And the response was what we now call the Big Gold Book. The response to that Big Gold Book, which was put together under the revising eyes of Jason Durrell and Sam Johnson, was positive. Why? Well, partly for the convenience of having so many options organized neatly in one place, finally, but also because it wasn't just a box of tools cut and pasted from various places. As Chaosium had done from the start, and as the authors of the collected Basic Roleplaying continued to do. The text explains the ideas behind the rules, uses plain terms, and still expects the reader to experiment and make up their own minds. What kind of game are you running? How do you conceive of the game you are running? How are you going to run the game that you're running? Like the authors of RuneQuest did, the authors of the Big Gold Book managed to elucidate something very important in addition to just collecting the rules. They managed to hit a very important note that is often lost in the rush to use whatever word will work well enough in the moment, but can fail when examined. Where most in RPGs would rush to use the word authority when explaining the separate spheres of influence in which the GM and players, let's say, operate in play, the text of BRP wisely indicates that this is not authority at all. It's responsibility. Because we are players of a game, and we, as players of a game, come together in play, and we must depend on one another for that time of play to be satisfying, meaningful, and/or fun. What's important is that we have a duty to facilitate that outcome for the group. And from that shared responsibility flows the taking on of roles and perspectives about the game and its various participants and elements to make that responsibility a reality. We can only really speak about who's empowered to make a particular decision over a particular thing at a particular time when we first understand the nature, source, and direction of that empowerment. The Big Gold Book makes that very clear and does so on pages 7 and 8. Some of my questions when I learned that the Big Gold Book of BRP would be revised in a new edition for 2023 were whether those authors would return, and in either case, would this important note remain a part of the text. Jason Durall did indeed return, and so too did the sections on player and GM responsibility. Now, on page 2. Much in the original book returned with it, which I guess should not be surprising, with a lot of familiar phrasing, though in a smaller font, which I don't think is entirely due to my aging eyes. Like with the opening example we used here of RuneQuest benefiting from the time between its release and that of the first RPG, the new edition of the standalone Basic Role-Playing Rulebook has likewise benefited from the intervening years. Where the first was aware and had some lines to spare for the different ways people conceive of and play their characters in the shared worlds in which they are imagined to act, react, and interact, the new edition manages to squeeze in a few more, and with greater awareness. For example, it manages to find acceptance for play centered consciously for story as product and for story as byproduct, without smearing either side. And it embraces both the values of the resistance table and the value of opposed roles. It's a wonder. It's worlds of wonder, and a really small page count for such incredible potency. So, any talk of system really should, in some way, talk about the system. So how does BRP work? Well, if you're unfamiliar, ultimately BRP rests its foundation on players understanding just from living their lives how likely something is, and interpreting that in the form of a percentage chance. This communicates the personal nature of risk from the perspective of the character, and allows for things like the tongues of greed and reward to lure some players into making dangerous decisions and send some characters into the fray or running into the arms of the local human resources center for some assistance. Through the quick and fluid use of D%, with occasional use of other dice to do things like inflict damage or determine a hit location, the game world, whatever it might be, can be made to quickly coalesce into a vibrant, believable, and appropriately consistent imagined place of incredible responsiveness, where there is little to distract the players or their GM from what's going on therein, and do so without sacrificing the enjoyment that comes from operating a smooth and powerfully running engine. So, I guess, after saying all of this, that it's pretty obvious that I like the system. I think it's safe to say that I like BRP. I think it's safe to say I rate BRP very highly, that it rides high in my estimation. I don't think that point is hidden at all. It's the system which, looking back right now, I realize I have known and kept fresh in mind and run regularly for the longest period compared to any other system. It's one of two mainstays or go-tos in my play that I will turn to settings that I have created or the people I'm playing with have created to play in, the other one being Ubiquity. It's really one of only a few systems which I keep up to date and run regularly in different iterations or different editions. In this case, I find I enjoy and find reasons to use its older or different editions, like for Call of Cthulhu or Pendragon. The masterfully presented Mithras and Delta Green are other examples where the system has moved beyond just Chaosium and has been turned to comparable purposes with incredible quality. And I would use these different versions of the system rather than brewing up my own version of BRP with my own set of things to include and things to exclude and things to keep and things to change for whatever game I might run. I enjoy it as it was, I enjoy it as it is, and I enjoy it as it can sometimes be made to be. Basic Roleplaying by Chaosium. All right. Well, it turns out I was quite blessed with an amount of uninterrupted time, and I'm not going to push the limit on that any further. I can already tell the natives are getting restless around me on their four-clawed feet with their rumbling stomachs. So, thank you for those of you who have listened through to the end. I appreciate it. Apologies again for the sporadic but not the ultimately sporadic nature of this podcast. Mainly, I'm sorry for the loss in momentum in the topic, but we'll get back to it. RPG A Day is about to begin, and I hope that you, like me, will be turning your attention now to contributing in some way that works for you to it, but not to the exclusion of your own plans and hopes and dreams and whatnot for your own podcasts and the like. But anyway, until the next one, take care. You have been listening to the Casting Shadows podcast. All the ways and means to contact us and find more of the things that we like to share online about role-playing games is in the show notes.